Governor Allen, talking about some things outside of the United States, our relationship with key countries in the Pacific Ocean. You served in the Senate, if I'm correct, on the Foreign Relations Committee. So I would particularly like your insights, recollections, and your current feelings on we have mainland China, that relations are up and down, Taiwan, that I'm sure wants to keep its relations with us very good. But how do we handle each country going forward? What do we do to maintain a proper balance and defend our interest and our commitments in that part of the world? Big topic. Roll with it.
All right. All right. First of all, China is obviously economically a strong country, and we are entangled with them in our supply chains. They are a communist country, but they have figured out a lot about the mercantile markets and have become very strong economically. It's the second biggest economy in the world, and their military is getting stronger and stronger. And for our national security, we need to have a strong economy as well. You can't have a strong military and national defense without a strong economic or strong economy. As far as Taiwan is concerned, Taiwan's a great example of freedom. We have the Taiwan Relations Act, which means that if Taiwan wants armaments for their defense, we'll sell them to them, and we ought to sell them and get them as many of those armaments as we can for their defense. China cheats. China has a long-term view of doing anything. They'll get away with cheating as long as they can, whether it's in semiconductor chips or anything else. And so what we need to do is recognize that China is a competitor and an adversary. I don't want to say they're an enemy, but they're an adversary. And one of the things we've learned through this pandemic is we're too highly vulnerable to China for our medicines and protective equipment. And we need to be getting more of the pharmaceutical ingredients and active agents being made either in the United States, preferably in the United States, or from suppliers from countries that are on our side, because we were very vulnerable for some of those medicines that we needed to get from China. You know, people in America, in the US, would not feed their dogs food from China. But here we were ingesting active pharmaceutical ingredients made in China, which don't have the same standards for safety or efficacy as we have in our country. And so for our national health, we ought to have, again, more of these medicines and supplies made in the US or from trusted countries and suppliers, whether it's Canada or Europe or wherever it may be from. The other thing is semiconductor chips. Taiwan's great in semiconductor chips. China is too. And we need to have more semiconductor chips, which are the basis of everything in our computing and communications and in commerce, made whether here in the US or again from reliable suppliers. We need to stay engaged with China. Even during the Cold War, the United States and the USSR leaders would talk to one another. But what we also ought to be doing is making sure that we keep good, strong alliances with countries that share our values in the Pacific theater. And that means South Korea, Japan, for that matter, the Philippines, Malaysia, Australia, India. We need to have strong relations with India. That's the world's largest democracy of 1.5 billion people. And we want to make sure they're on our side as well as China tries to expand its influence. Now, China is expanding its influence beyond the Pacific. They go into, if they can, try to get into South America, into Africa and other countries, and then end up having those countries beholden and indebted to them as they get those resources. And so we need to be very, very skeptical, trust but verify, so to speak, that Reagan thought in dealing with China. And some of our really harmful, whimsical policies on energy, the people of Russia, the leaders of Russia and China have to laugh at our country. some they think we're going to run our economy on sources of energy that are dependent on the weather, wind and solar, and so many of those critical earth minerals and key components are mined and come from China. Meanwhile, China, they want to make sure their citizens have reliable, affordable electricity, and they're putting in coal-fired power plants every month. And here we are shutting down our natural gas and our coal, and thinking we're going to run our economy on these unreliable, very expensive sources of electricity coming from wind and solar that make no sense. And then we have to import all of that from China on top of it all. It just makes no sense if we want to be a strong, competitive country.
You have traveled to Taiwan, I believe, on several occasions.
Several
I'm not
times.
sure the exact number.
And to China and Hong Kong.
And China and Hong Kong with it. The Taiwan, well, that island itself, can it supply, or how much of our current, shall we say, technological needs, the semiconductors and things like that, do we, to your knowledge, do we receive from Taiwan? Could we manage, we meaning the United States, manage solely with Taiwan as a supplier, or do we need mainland China's support on things like that as well?
Well, it's not just Taiwan is the preeminent, and they're really the best in the world. We rely on a lot of different sources. We rely on China. We rely on Taiwan. We rely on some chips even from South Korea. And obviously, we fabricate our own chips. When I was governor, we got semiconductor fabs locating in Virginia. It was Toshiba and IBM was one of them, which is Japan and the U.S., and then the others, Motorola and Siemens, which is out of Germany. And so all of them, you want a lot of different sources. One of the things our country, with this CHIPS Act, we're trying to get more of them now fabricated in the United States, which is important for our national security and also for, obviously, our economy. When chips are down, people think, oh, all that matters is your smartphones and computers. No, it's everything. It's appliances. Automobiles are a big part of it. And so in fact, automobiles were slowed down in production, not because they couldn't get tires or they couldn't get brake pads or pistons and spark plugs. They couldn't get the chips. And anybody knows anything about automobiles anymore, it's you have to understand computers more than understanding kind of mechanics in it. So it's not as if we could rely on just one country. You have a diversity of sources in your supply chains. What you want are reliable supply chains and not ones that are going to be adverse to you for our security. I'm talking about our military, as well as for our economy. And if you're relying on China, if China thinks that it's not in the best interest of China and the Chinese Communist Party, they just could cut off chips. They could cut off, just like they did with PPE and pharmaceuticals. They just could cut it off like that, and there you are, high and dry, and vulnerable. So Taiwan's really important, and also are other countries. But I'd like to see more of those chips and active pharmaceutical ingredients manufactured here in the USA, where you know that they're safe, that they've been properly tested, and we're in control of our own health and economic destiny.
Well, I believe you told me on occasions, with so many things, there's a lot to be said for homegrown, whatever it may be.
Right.
And that is the best and safest system, whatever you're speaking of, across the board.
Yeah, and you're better off homegrown, but there's certain things that Taiwan's really good at, and we can learn from them. And Taiwan is under constant pressure from the Communist Party in China. I mean, they're just inundating that. I so admire the people of Taiwan, that they have their elections and the misinformation, disinformation, lies. We talk about what happens in campaigns here, and what you can't believe what's on Twitter or Facebook or all the bots and so forth. The stuff that they get hit with, inundated with in Taiwan from China is just overwhelming, but they still see through to the truth. They discern what is right. And so they should never be coerced into giving up their sovereignty in their system. And we need to stand with them. And it's not so much as our troops, but they get the armaments. And I think that China's looking to some extent of what we do, and it's not just us, but it's NATO and other countries with Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And so it's important that we, in my view, support Ukraine and their self-determination. And we do have the Taiwan Relations Act, and that's absolutely essential. We adhere to it in Taiwan because it's good for freedom, and it's also good for our own country with it.
It's a complex topic, and how it will play out over the next 3 to 5 years. So with many things, who knows? But
well, you don't know, but here's things you do know. You could say who knows, yeah. But a lot of what your future is determined by what you do now, the decisions you make now. And we can't show any fecklessness or weakness in standing up to these authoritarian governments, whether it's Putin or whether it's the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese communists are different, so much different than the old Soviets or the Cubans. They have their students. They have their students in our colleges and universities. They're learning the best practices on hydraulic fracking, best agricultural practices, best technologies, best energy policies. They have hundreds of thousands of students in our schools, so they're learning the best. The Russians, the old Soviets, and the Cubans, they wouldn't let anybody out because they worried about them defecting. Mm-hmm. And so China, the people of China are industrious people. They're very smart. The only thing that's holding them back, to some extent, is their authoritarian government. And the hope is that as people got to see with the rest of the world, they wouldn't tolerate, restrictions on their freedom. But China is a growing strong power. They've gotten worse in this respect. Even when the Communist Party was the sole party, they had term limits, so you wouldn't have anybody more than 2 terms. The current President Xi is now president for life. We talked in the other segment about George Washington serving 2 terms. And so it's become more authoritarian. There was a point where they were getting more enlightened in the way that they were treating their citizens and becoming, or not a threat to other places around the world, but they're becoming much more aggressive. They continue to steal our intellectual property or coerce the sharing of secrets for any company that wants to do business. And China said they're a heck of an adversary, and they're very smart. They're very determined. They have long-range plans, and they stick to it. And they have accomplished much of what they have planned out for decades. And we need to stay steadfast and understand what we're standing. We're standing for freedom, but recognize that things are not inevitable. The decisions we make now will have ramifications for generations to come.
A lot of insight there, a lot of history, and I say we're preparing. What's being done now will be history in a few years, but as you say, it's the prologue to what will be the future out of something like that. Always appreciated, Governor Allen. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.